Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 31C, an interview on Herbert Hoover and the start of the Great Depression with Robert McElvaine. I'm excited to welcome Robert McElvaine to the show today. Bob is a professor of history at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, and an expert on the Great Depression, a topic Bob has written a handful of books on, including The Great Depression, America 1929 to 1941, Down and Out in the Great Depression, Letters from the Forgotten Man, and Mississippi, the WPA Guide to the Magnolia State. He's also written about other things. His most recent book is The Times They Were A-Changin', 1964, the year the 60s arrived and the battle lines of today were drawn. We're going to focus on the Great Depression, though, today, and Hoover's attempts to solve it and where it started. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So if we're to tell the story of the Great Depression, where does that story begin? Is this a story that starts with the stock market, the Treaty of Versailles, like the Panic of 1907? Where does it begin?
Well, let's see, the evolution of humans. No, we don't have to go back. I do want to go back a little bit further even than like the Treaty of Versailles, because I think the critical thing is changes in the economy and the attitudes of government not kind of keeping up with the changes in the needs of the economy. The Republican Party, when it was founded in the 1850s and on through the time of the Civil War and Reconstruction and a bit after that, was very much for the working man and was not like, they instituted an income tax, and Lincoln was very clear that it should be a graduated tax and people who earned more should pay a higher rate and all that sort of thing that, Republicans today don't believe in. Well, by the so-called Gilded Age, and Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age. We should now call it the first Gilded Age because we're in a second Gilded Age now, meaning that this is not a golden age. It's one that looks gold on the outside, but underneath there's all the decay. There's extreme wealth at the top and poverty below. During that period, the Republican Party started switching in the other direction, although, of course, during the progressive era, actually there were more progressive Republicans than there were Democrats with Theodore Roosevelt and others. But kind of William McKinley in the 1890s is a good example of where the Republicans were headed, probably better than the sort of detour Teddy Roosevelt took them on.
Yeah.
And so basically, beginning around that time, there's a difference in outlook between the parties on the economy. The Democrats are still the very bad guys on race and all that, and
Yep.
better. But on the economy, I guess the best summation of it was from William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896 when he said, "There are two ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, that prosperity will leak through on those below. The democratic idea has been if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it." And that's basically been this difference all along, whether we do trickle-down economics, of course, kind of basically just comes straight from what he said. It will leak through to those below.
Right.
And the Republicans were wedded to that. To some extent, a great maldistribution of wealth and income has existed in most societies, and you can question that morally, but as far as what it was doing to the economy, may not have mattered that much until mass production comes in. And mass production with Henry Ford and all is coming along by the time of World War I, and then in the 1920s, it's really taken off. And the thing about mass production, it's great, but in order to keep the economy going, it needs mass consumption. And in order for the masses to consume, they have to be getting enough of the money to consume it. And basically what was going on in the 1920s, productivity was increasing greatly, wages were going up some, but profits were going up enormously, and the income is being more and more concentrated at the top. Significantly, the share of income going to like the top 5%, the top 1%, even the top 1/100th of a percent, peaked just before the economy collapsed at the end of the 20s. Interestingly, it reached about the same level in 2008 before the economy collapsed then. And the basic reason is, again, whatever you may think of the maldistribution morally, it just doesn't work in a consumption-based economy. But during the 20s, with Harding and Coolidge, not so much Hoover, I'll get back to that in a minute, but they were very much in favor of a totally unregulated economy. The market, free market is God to be worshipped. And Andrew Mellon, who was one of the richest people in the world and was Secretary of the Treasury throughout this period of Republican ascendancy from 1921 through Hoover, sometimes we say that 3 presidents served under Andrew Mellon. Mellon was totally committed to cutting taxes and cutting taxes that were only being paid by the rich at the time. And that was exactly the wrong thing to be doing, because it was taking more money, less of the money was available to the people who had to buy things to keep this mass production economy going. The people who could afford to buy not one automobile, and automobiles were getting to be a really big thing in the 20s, who could afford to buy, 100 automobiles, they weren't going to do that. They might, like 6 or something, but they're not going to buy 100. And so, but the people out there who would want to buy them basically didn't have the money. And so this is really the underlying problem leading to the Depression, at least as I see it, that there's a couple of ways. Couple means 2. There's more than 2. There's a few ways, is a better way to put it, that you might be able to deal with that. One, you could have government intervention. Government could go into deficit spending. There was no chance the views of the leadership was going to do that at the time. You could try to sell the surplus abroad, but that simply wouldn't work, because yen-less Chinese were no better than penniless Americans at buying things. You had to have people who had money, and that meant the other industrialized countries, and they were facing similar problems, and they can't all be selling to each other. And so what they finally, a few things that are important. One thing, during the 20s, they're undermining traditional values. I mean, these people, Calvin Coolidge is like the epitome of traditional values. But for the economy to work, they've got to undermine all these Benjamin Franklin aphorisms: a penny saved is a penny earned.
Right. Yeah.
Don't save for a rainy day. They called it the new era of eternal prosperity. Don't worry about tomorrow. And so they're undermining all these things, trying to get people to go ahead and buy. And advertising is getting to be bigger and bigger. The basic generic message of advertising is, go ahead. You want that, just go ahead and get it. Don't worry about tomorrow. And that's so that kind of stimulates more demand. By the end, it was during the 20s that advertising started to be called an industry, which is kind of weird when you think about it. You think of an industry producing things. Well, what advertising produces is consumption, not products. And so it's the other side. It was like 10% of the economy was going towards advertising by the end of the 20s. Wow. And so, and they would have in advertising trade publications like ads saying, go ahead and make me want. This whole idea you should restrain yourself and all the old Protestant ethic things, they were preaching that in some ways, but they couldn't promote that because it was the opposite of what they wanted. Okay, so people start wanting the things, but they still don't have the money. So what to do? Well, let them buy it without the money. And the word credit, of course, in the sense of credit and debit, had been around again since Adam and Eve, maybe not quite that far, but emphasizing the word credit became a big thing in the 1920s. And that sounds so much better than what it really is: debt. Uh,
Yeah.
oh, this is to my credit. Oh, this is wonderful. Uh, they
Yep.
didn't
Yep.
yet have credit cards, but those cards we all carry around or sit in front of our computer with or whatever now.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
if they were called what they really are, debt cards, we'd be a little less likely
Absolutely.
to use them. MasterCard, let the possibilities master you. Master the possibilities. Really, it means let the possibilities master you. So,
Hmm.
so this worked for a while to keep the economy going in the 20s because
Hmm.
people could buy these things and be paying them off. But the problem with that, of course, is that eventually you're going to run out of the credit. Uh, some later times, lenders keep willing to just keep raising your credit limit and everything. They were not quite going that far in the 20s, and so once somebody had kind of exhausted their credit, not only did they not have a chance to get credit to buy new things, they also couldn't buy new things with much of their current income because that was going to pay off past purchases. And so this is just a recipe for, well, Hoover and others kept saying the economy is fundamentally sound, but the basic problem is the economy was fundamentally unsound because of all this. So they're changing all these values in the 20s, and the people who do have money, and it's called a prosperity decade. The prosperity was not all that widespread. Like farmers, for instance, were pretty much in depression throughout the 20s.
Right.
They didn't keep official statistics on unemployment, but the best estimates are that unemployment was around 10% throughout this
Wow.
period of prosperity. But the people who did have money, they wanted more. And so they're looking for, uh, which sort of this whole idea and the way values are being overturned. I think sometime around the 20s and certainly later, during the Depression and World War II, they sort of moved back towards the traditional values. But after that, after the post World War II era, going back more and more, I think sort of the anthem of the modern economy should be, "I can't get no satisfaction," because the idea
For
is
sure.
keep the consumer dissatisfied. They used to say in these advertising publications, if the consumer is satisfied, he's not going to buy anything, and that's no good for us. So you don't want that. People looking to make more money. Well, the first big boom bubble in the 20s was in Florida real estate.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the automobile and building, and of course the prosperity was largely because of a lot of these new products. Automobiles weren't new, but as a real mass for the masses to buy them, it was new. Then they have radios, and for the automobiles, that stimulates the steel industry and all these things to build them, but also building roads and concrete to build the roads and diners and motels and whatnot along the way. So those roads make it possible for those who have money to get away from the winters in the Northeast and go to Florida. And so Florida real estate starts really booming around 1923, 24 especially, and the prices just keep going up. Most of the people that start buying it never see it at all. It's
Huh.
advertised, as beachfront property, and some people, again, they'd have to be rich enough, actually want beachfront property and plan to use it. But because the price keeps going up, people start buying it for speculation. And the fact that some
That
of
sounds
these
familiar.
lots might be 25 miles inland in a swamp really didn't make any difference because the only reason they were buying it and paying much more than it was worth was because they could count on somebody else a few months later paying them even more for it. And the only reason that person was doing it because so the classic bubble, uh, you know, it keeps expanding, and I don't know. Some people who are good at blowing bubbles can have them not
Yeah.
bursting, but it was bound to burst. A couple of hurricanes came through and
Hmm.
caused that to collapse. But this was basically a dress rehearsal for what happened in the stock market then in the later 20s. Kind of the same thing. The traditionally people bought stocks as investments and expected to get dividends and all that. But increasingly in the later 20s, the idea was that we were just going to see the prices go up. and we're doing it to speculate. Probably the best example of that, kind of the version of the internet boom around the beginning of the century, was RCA, the Radio
Yeah.
of America, this new thing. And the price just kept going up and up, sort of like Amazon did at the beginning. They were never turning a profit. They weren't paying any dividends, but the price just kept going up, and people thought this is this exotic new thing from the technology, and everybody's going to have it, and all that was true, but it was going up crazily. Well, but in addition to that, and like the price of RCA stock went up by, I don't remember the exact figure, but something like 80% over 1 year. But you could buy without having the money, just like consumers could buy things without having the money. Brokers would lend money to people to buy the stocks. What's called buying on margin, and this was kind of fantastic. You could put up, say, 10% of the price and borrow the rest, using the stock as the collateral for what you were borrowing. And so this was kind of magical. Let me give you an example here with RCA. At the beginning of 1928, if you put up the $10 for the $85 price and borrowed the remaining $75 from your broker, at the end of the year, you would have sold it for $420. The price had gone up that much. The stock itself had appreciated by 394%, which isn't bad. But if you had done this borrowing, this $10 investment could bring back $341.25, $420 less the $75 you paid and the 5% interest, and the profit for your year was 3,400%. So this was good. But the trouble is that this whole idea of buying on margin works in the opposite direction once the price starts going down.
For sure.
And the only reason the prices are going up is the prices are going up. Whatsoever to the value of the company. But people were so caught up in this. And again, like the public was sort of following the Dow Jones average the way they were following Babe Ruth's batting average and stuff. But the public was not much into the stock market, certainly as a percentage of what it was all worth. It was mostly much richer people. So but they were so optimistic that there were a couple of times when the stock market price dropped kind of precipitously in 1928 and earlier in 1929, but they kept saying, oh, it's going to go up. By the time you get to the summer of 1929, this problem of not having enough buyers for the stuff that's being sold begins to really become evident. Because again, credit is exhausted for so many people. And as I said a minute ago, they also don't have all of their current income to buy more things with because they're paying off these other things. And so when that happens, companies start seeing their unsold goods on their warehouse shelves, and they do the only sensible thing to do. They cut back production, which causes people to be laid off, which causes those people to have even less money. And so the aggregate of this in the economy is that the already insufficient amount of money to buy the goods that are coming off the production lines becomes less, and that becomes a downward spiral where more goods start piling up in the inventory, more people are laid off, and so on. This was already going on a few months before the stock market crashed, but people were just sort of ignoring it. Again, the problem was that the economy was fundamentally unsound. So you get to October of 1929, and over, it's not just a single day, but a series of days, for several of the days within a week, culminating in October 29th, where the total collapse occurs. And here again, the leverage fits into this too, because as I said before, the collateral for the loan is your stock, and the stock suddenly plummets in value, and the loan gets called in by the lender. and the only thing they can do is try to sell it for whatever price they can get, but that's not going to be nearly enough, and so it keeps causing the prices to go down more and more. And so, to the question of did the stock market crash cause the depression? Well, if you mean it in the real sense of causing it, absolutely not. If you mean it in the sense of did it have something to do with the timing? Yes. What it really was more reflective of other problems already in the economy. Um, so when that occurred, Hoover had been worried about that before.
Okay.
We're talking about Hoover, so let's get back to Hoover. Hoover Hoover obviously has a very bad reputation, and for some of the things he did, that's accurate. He was basically a good person, a progressive. There was a biography written of him a few decades ago called "The Forgotten Progressive."
Mm.
He had during his career of getting richer and richer and engineering and so forth around the world. He was sort of like a military leader being abroad who didn't identify with a party. He didn't vote. He didn't say whether he was Republican or Democrat. And then he did these marvelous things that I won't get into because they were discussed in the previous episode, but just mention organizing the Belgian relief and then coming back to the United States and doing the food program in the United States during World War I, coming in and sort of supervising saving Central Europe at the end of World War I, leading to him having this reputation as being this gruff humanitarian, which is a pretty good description of him. And both parties considered him as a possible presidential candidate in 1920, extremely popular. The thing, and he decided he was a Republican. Again, it was discussed last time that Franklin Roosevelt was one of those who thought he would be a really good person for this.
Yeah.
Wanted to get a ticket where he would be Hoover would be the Democratic nominee and FDR would be the vice presidential candidate, partly because FDR was always imagining himself following the footsteps of Cousin Ted.
Absolutely.
And the vice president was something to check off on that. But anyway, but Hoover decided he was a Republican. The Republicans knew he was a great candidate, but as one of the party bosses said at the 1920 Republican convention, the times don't demand a good candidate. We're going, people are going to reject everything with the Democrats because of Woodrow Wilson, and things are turning in the other direction. And so they got what the bosses really wanted, a pliable man in terms of Warren G. Harding, and that they could sort of do as they wanted with, and he would let all sorts of corruption go on around him and all the rest of that. And Hoover wound up as Secretary of Commerce, and as they said, he was the greatest Secretary of Commerce ever, which could seem like a sort of backward compliment because who remembers anything? But he really did do a lot of good stuff, but that was talked about the last time as well. And so by 1928, back up a little, Hoover did put out a book, I think it was 1923, called American Individualism. And like with most books, I can speak from my own experience, some people read the title, but most people won't read the book. And so that people thought he meant this sort of rugged individualism, every man for himself kind of thing, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is an interesting thing. It occurred to me some years ago. Try to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Physics is an impossibility in physics. Yeah. You can pull up one foot, but it's just interesting that this is the recommendation for people, and it's absolutely possible. Well, Hoover wasn't into that. Hoover believed that people should help each other. He was a Quaker, and he believed in voluntarism. That people should voluntarily be giving to charities, because this was not only good for the people receiving the charity, but it was good for the person giving the money voluntarily. This was good, good for them as human beings, good for their soul. And that's kind of what he was preaching, a sort of cooperation, but not being imposed by the government. But he had used government like, he organized those things back at the beginning of World War One and during World
Yeah.
War One and everything. But he raised a lot of money privately, but he also
Yeah.
got government money in as well. But he was somebody who had really strong beliefs, and that could be a good thing. He was inflexible. And it's interesting that different words for kind of the same quality can sound good or bad.
Yeah.
Inflexible, steadfast, but like bullheaded or unwilling to look at evidence, and meaning pretty much the same thing. I'm just going to keep going. And this was
Yeah.
really the biggest difference. I'm hesitating to say biggest difference, but it probably was the biggest difference between Hoover and FDR. FDR famously said before he was elected, when he was running in 1932, take a method and try it. If it doesn't work, throw it away and try something else. But above all, try something. Well,
Yeah.
Hoover never actually said this, but if we were to put his beliefs in that context, he would say, take the method, because there was only one. Try it. If it doesn't work, try it again. If it doesn't work, try it again. But above all, keep trying the same thing. He was a believer in how the market could work. He was a believer in it's absolutely essential to balance the budget, and he was a believer that giving out money to people, the dole, would undermine their self-reliance. And of course, all that was true. FDR believed that as well, and it's true. It can undermine their self-reliance. But the thing is, if people die, their self-reliance is undermined on a more permanent basis. They starve to death. And, FDR didn't really believe in that either, but he did believe in keeping people alive, and there was no other opportunity to do it. But Hoover did do much more in the face of an economic collapse than any president before him had done. And so again, he believed in the free market, but only up to a point. And he believed in government intervention as long as it didn't unbalance the budget too much, and as long as it wasn't like permanent, it was just for an emergency. Mm-hmm. So he initially, and I should mention that he had seen these problems in the economy and had in fact earlier in 1929, after he became president, had his broker quietly sell a lot of his stocks because he saw things were going downhill. A little to that with Calvin Coolidge, his wife, when Coolidge decided not to run in 1928. Later, his wife said, "Papa saw a depression coming." Well, I don't think Coolidge saw a depression coming. He wanted to put his feet up on the desk again. Which he did as president, but that's another story. He never did much of anything.
Right.
But so Hoover had sold a lot of his own stocks. But the thing is, when things seem to be getting better, people don't want to hear anything about that. And in a political sense, how are you going to do something that would cause, again, deflating the bubble without bursting it is really a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, his first years, first months in presidency,
Yeah, Hoover kind of couldn't do that much about it. But of course, he had talked about how we're in this eternal era of prosperity. We're within the day, with the help of God, when we will see the end of poverty in America.
Right.
And he was almost right. It was just another P word. It was the end of prosperity, not poverty.
Zinger.
Into his administration. He was not, he and his policies were not responsible for this.
Right.
However, his approach to it, and part of this, Hoover is sort of in the right place at the wrong time. He could have been a good president had he, say, in 1920, been chosen by one of the parties and won then, and prosperity was going on. But Hoover's whole experience was that you keep succeeding. You keep getting prosperous, and so he couldn't kind of relate to what was going on with these people. Like he infamously said at one point, I think it was probably in 1931, I noticed that more people have decided to leave their previous employment for the more lucrative job of selling apples on street corners.
What?
The Washington apple growers had decided that they could sell apples by letting unemployed people sell them on street corners.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Hoover had never left his previous job unless it was for a better job, and he just couldn't relate to this. But
Oh, wow.
this sounded so uncaring. He wasn't really uncaring, but he sure sounded that way.
Yes. Yes. You
But
just didn't get
he
it.
did organize. He believed very much that the key was restoring confidence. He was singularly a poor person to restore confidence, though. He was, very dour and,
Yeah.
the opposite FDR in that regard. Um, Another good example of that, another famous, maybe the most famous quotation from FDR in his first inaugural address: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, blind, unreasoning terror." That's pretty much the same thing Hoover had been saying all along to restore confidence. But when he said it, especially after a year, another year had passed, when FDR said it, they swooned. This is wonderful.
Right. Right.
But also he was new. So Hoover tried to, he understood the need for keeping up purchasing power. He didn't seem to understand what, like Mellon's tax policies and things had done to make that worse. But one of the first things he did was to, in addition to saying that the economy is fundamentally sound, he called together top business leaders and got them to pledge not to cut wages for a year, which was a good thing. However, they didn't pledge not to lay people off. So the people who kept their jobs, actually, since prices were going down for a little while, they were better off for that year. But the economy as a whole, the buying power just kept falling because more and more people were being thrown out of work. It reminds me of Calvin Coolidge again. When the Depression was going on, he thought about it for quite a while, and he said, when more and more people are thrown out of work, unemployment results. And he thought for another year and made one of his famous, very short statements. He said, "The solution to unemployment is work."
Wow.
Unfortunately, we didn't have his brilliance still to build. So Hoover did that, and that was fine for the people who stayed employed and their wages didn't go down. But after a year, they started cutting the wages as well as laying more people off. And the thing that was really needed was well summed up. Of course, John Maynard Keynes is associated with the basic theory, and he was writing about that well before his basic theory book came out in the mid-30s. But there were other people talking about it. And one example, these two economists, Waddell Kitchings and William Trufant Foster, wrote an article called "When the Horse Balks" in 1930. And the way they put it was, if anyone still doubts that our economic troubles are mainly mental, let them consider what would happen if the United States declared war today. Everybody knows what would happen. Congress would immediately stop the interminable talk and appropriate $3 billion, $5 billion, $10 billion. Now, where would the money come from? They wouldn't worry about it. And they suggest that the solution to the Depression is pretend we're at war. They were exactly right. Mitch McConnell infamously said when Obama's presidency started, well, you can learn a lot from history. History teaches us a lot. And if you look at what happened during the Great Depression, it shows that spending doesn't work because the Depression was still going on in 1939. Yes, well, that's true, but it does not show that spending doesn't work. He said World War II ended the Depression. Exactly, because they spent like that. If they had spent like that in 1933, which Roosevelt was willing to go into deficit spending, but he wasn't willing to go in the massive way that was needed. But World War II totally confirmed what Foster and Catchings had said, what Keynes had said, that this
Mm.
is the way you do it. Of course, you've got to find some way. But I mean, the massive debt in World War II was paid down remarkably quickly. So that did work. Hoover did other things like, again, trying to restore confidence. He put together presidential committees. He was trying to collect suggestions from the public. The president's emergency committee on unemployment, the president's organization for unemployment relief. And they would put out like ads. There was one that showed a working man saying, "I'll see it through if you will." No, that didn't do much to pay the rent or fill your stomachs or anything like that. So
Yeah.
if for a while, this great engineer and this gruff humanitarian, people would sort of stick with him. But when month after month things kept getting worse, he did other things, though. The most important probably was creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which
Yeah.
FDR used much more than he did. But Hoover, as I said a few minutes ago, didn't want to give relief directly to people.
Right.
He thought this would destroy their self-reliance, their initiative. He didn't seem to worry about the self-reliance and initiative of banks, though. He was willing to give them a lot of money. And, you could make economic arguments for that, like, again, the 2008 collapse and whether this is terrible, they're giving all this money to the people who caused it, but, like, what's the choice? The whole world economy will collapse if you don't. But the way this was perceived in the public, and with a lot of accuracy to it, was he's giving money to the rich people and he won't give money. Like there was a drought that was sort of the prelude to the Dust Bowl that was in Arkansas during and surrounding areas during the time Hoover was still president, and he would send pig feed and cattle feed. He wasn't worried about the farm animals losing their self-reliance, but he wouldn't send any food for the people. And so all of this just increasingly produced this reputation as this guy is totally uncaring, and he just basically wouldn't change his ways because he was afraid of debt, and he believed that there is only one way, and this is the way, and we just have to keep doing it.
And you mentioned in passing the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corp. Can you explain really quickly what that is for folks?
Well, not really, but but I mean, basically, the idea was to use the government to put money into things that would help, and particularly it was being used under Hoover to prop up the banks. But it could be used for other things, and FDR used it for other things. Another thing that Hoover did was try to, again, keep demand up by investing in public works projects. That was on a much bigger scale under FDR, but he was doing it. And one of them was building what came to be called the Hoover Dam, and
right.
So unpopular they changed the name to the Boulder Dam, but later some Republican administration changed it back to the Hoover Dam. And he kept trying to stimulate private charity, and that worked. The amount of money people were donating in private charities went up by huge amounts. But the thing was, this disaster was so big that it was beyond that working. It needed the government to go in. Oh, another thing, as far as trying to maintain or rebuild confidence, the word that was traditionally used for these economic collapses,
right?
Panic.
Yeah.
Hoover says that's terrible. The word depression had been occasionally used before, but he decided to emphasize depression, like things are going along and then there's a little dip of depression and it comes back. But so he became totally associated with this word, and this word came to be probably even worse than panic, but he was trying to use it to not sound so bad. So.
And I want to ask, what made this depression so much worse than previous ones? You described earlier the big house of cards that had been built. What made the collapse worse than all the others and in such a hard place to fix?
Well, the biggest thing again is that this was the first one that occurred when the economy was really dependent on mass consumption. And
So it's just that the house of cards had been built so much bigger than ever before. That's why the collapse was bigger.
yeah, well, maybe not just, but I think
Okay.
that's the biggest reason. And then they did other things that were counterproductive, like Hoover decided to try to raise taxes because
Right.
the budget was unbalanced, and that was not a good idea.
Yeah.
Interestingly, FDR criticized him for being a spendthrift. FDR gave a speech in the 1932 campaign in Pittsburgh where he said that he was spending more money and a 25% increase in spending, and this was terrible. And
Hmm.
FDR came in and immediately started spending much more than that. The
Right.
advisors were sitting around and they said, "Well, what can we do about what you said in this speech in Pittsburgh?" And one of them said, "The only thing you can do is deny you were ever in Pittsburgh."
That's good.
So yeah, so whatever he tried didn't seem to work, and his reputation kept getting worse. The reputations of big businessmen, bankers, were just going down the tubes.
So I can only imagine that Hoover's trying all these things, and he has this reputation of being the guy that fixes things. He was the CRB, he's the guy who handled all this stuff before, but this time it's not working. That must have been really demoralizing for him. How did he weather that disappointment? Were there any points where he gave up or anything like that?
I'm not a Hoover biographer. I don't know that
Hmm.
much about specifics of it. Clearly, it was very upsetting to him. I'm pretty sure that he would never reach the point of giving up, though. That was just not in
Yeah.
his nature. But this isn't working. But yet, it's the only thing that can work.
Just
But
keep trying.
he'd do these other things around the edges. But the
Mhm.
only thing, and it's understandable. I mean, the
Yeah.
idea that a government can spend a whole lot more money than it's taking in, and then what? But not understanding that a government can reach the point where just like an individual who does that is in a lot of trouble, but it's not the same thing as an individual having to balance their budget. And after all, they weren't. They were encouraging people to spend more than they had coming in all along to keep the economy going before that. But he could never bring himself to do that.
And I'm curious, one of the things that Hoover did that I don't think we've dove into yet is, as I understand it, he started lying about the economy's performance. He started lying about how many unemployed people there were. He had changed the statistics. And it's easy to look at and be like, well, that's terrible. That's really dumb. But could it also be looked at through this other lens of the economy really is how people feel about it? And maybe he thought that lying about it would encourage people to think things were better and then they'd spend more. Because, it's so much people just got to spend more. Like they got to. We have to somehow get people to stop putting dollars under the mattress. We have to keep money flowing through the economy.
Yeah, that's a good point. He would say things. Well, he would say, "Well, nobody has actually starved." And that wasn't really true. I mean,
Right.
not a high percentage starved, but a lot of people were very hungry. I mean, there were people. One helpful suggestion, I'm saying facetiously helpful, that some. I think it was some of the Princeton eating clubs or something. They were saying that they should use like the half-eaten rolls and leftover pieces of steak and stuff to give to the poor, which I suppose is better than nothing.
Right.
A lot of people would go through the trash cans outside of restaurants getting stuff that was thrown out.
Yeah.
That those trash cans were an intermediary step. It would go on to garbage dumps, and people would go through garbage dumps. And a couple of anecdotes about that. There was a woman who said she was in the practice of taking her glasses off when she was eating a piece of meat from the garbage dump so she wouldn't see the
Ooh.
maggots if they were there.
Oh, wow.
There were people in rural areas who ate weeds, which, I mean,
Yeah.
dandelions are actually used by master chefs sometimes, but they would say they would know which weeds to eat because they would see which ones the cows ate. The cows knew which ones were poisonous. So,
Wow.
And so, I mean, it starts to upend all the traditional structures,
Yeah.
like gender structures, and because the man is supposed to be the provider, and the men, unemployment, and it's sort of irony that women benefited, I put that in quotation marks, to some extent from the discrimination against them, in that the jobs that largely disappeared were industrial jobs that the women were excluded from. Whereas things like being a teacher, well, teachers, I had to keep teaching. They might not pay them every other month or something.
Right. Right.
They were household employees and this sort of thing. And so, in many cases, men found themselves without work and more, especially during the Hoover administration, because there was still this kind of feeling that everybody, and Hoover certainly believed this, that everybody's kind of responsible for himself, and you
Yeah.
get what you deserve. And during the 20s, as the majority of people were doing better, again, not quite as better as not nearly as better as the people at the top, but they were kind of feeling good about that, patting themselves on the back. I'm doing better.
Yeah.
And so when it suddenly turns around, it's kind of hard not to blame yourself, and particularly
Yeah.
not when kind of the extent of how bad things are in the entire economy. People kind of they start keeping to themselves and not seeing some of their friends and neighbors and realizing they're in the same situation because they're so
Right.
embarrassed about being that way themselves.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That was another thing that FDR kind of changed by making it very clear that this is a national disaster that we're dealing with on
Yeah.
a national basis. And then by having relief programs where people would come together and see other people in the same situation. And
Yeah.
oddly, for a lot of people, it's easier to believe that something is my fault than, well, no, look at this guy. That can't be his fault.
Yeah. Yeah. How interesting. So after several years of this Great Depression, unsurprisingly, Hoover loses re-election.
Mm-hmm.
But before FDR is sworn in, Hoover tries to get Roosevelt to sign off his support for a plan that Roosevelt refuses to do. Can you tell me more about what's happening during this final stretch of Hoover's presidency, a stretch where, as I understand it, a ton of banks start failing also?
Yes. Okay. So Hoover, and talking about how he was feeling in all this, as it became clearer and clearer that Roosevelt was going to win the election by a landslide, people were turned against him enormously, and it's kind of fascinating. Talking again about what he had done during World War One and after World War One, he was such a hero. There were streets named after him in Europe, Hooverstrasse or Rue de Hoover. Well, it was named after him during his presidency, where shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. And so,
right.
That's got to hurt. So. And he again still believing that this way that I'm doing things is the only way, it's the right way. And finally, his last big speech, I think it was the last one, but at least one of the last ones in the campaign, he started talking about the witches' cauldrons that have boiled and bubbled in Russia are coming here, basically accusing him of being a communist. But oddly, it seems to me at least that the more, not that most people wanted communism, certainly not if they knew what it really was, but the idea that that Roosevelt might be sort of more socialist, and socialism has been very popular. People talk about well, if Trump is in jail, can he run in 2024? Well, Eugene V. Debs ran for president in 1920 from the Atlanta penitentiary, where Woodrow Wilson had put him for speaking freely, basically, and got about 1 million votes. It seems to me that, Roosevelt was not really talking much in anything but generalities, like about a New Deal for the American people. But not really, except in maybe one speech outlining much of what that really meant. And I think the more Hoover and some others attacked him as being like a socialist probably helped him some because, well, this capitalism thing isn't seeming to work very well. Maybe we need to turn to that. So that's how, Hoover was just out of it by that time. And so then after Roosevelt was elected, he, at that point, it's all the way till March until the new administration comes in.
Right.
And even worse than that, there's a lame duck session of Congress. Congress normally had a session that started in December after the election. So election years, that Congress that met after the election was the old Congress because the new one didn't come in until the new year.
Right.
And so people who had been rejected by the voters were making the rules.
It's the saddest party.
Hoover's trying, things are getting worse and worse. And Hoover's saying, we have to restore confidence. I need you to come and endorse my policies. And Roosevelt, endorse your policies. He didn't say this. He probably said it to people around him. But that's the last thing that would restore confidence. People want to hope that something different's going to happen. So he's not about to do that. Plus, after all, coming in with things in absolute collapse is a good place to start. You
can only go up, hopefully.
So
got it. So what is the legacy of Hoover's attempts to answer the Great Depression? What do we learn from what he tried and how he failed?
Well, you or any listeners, I'm hoping you have a large number of listeners, who may have read to their children the Berenstain Bears bike lesson, where the father bear keeps teaching the kid how to ride the bike and doing it all the wrong way. And each time the kid says, that was a very good lesson for me on what not to do. Well, that's kind of what Hoover provided. In other words, to be open to more other possibilities and not just stick to one way, to not think that this, and again, it's kind of unfair to Hoover to just lump him into trickle-down economics. He was not as bad in that as others. But one of the things that he did was to show that doesn't work. And the the classical economics of a totally free market, and I'm absolutely in favor of capitalism, but not without restrictions. After World War II, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, except for every other one that's ever been tried.
Right. Famous quote.
The American founding fathers understood something like that. They were very worried about the excesses of democracy, so they set up checks and balances. And I think the same thing should be said about capitalism. It's the worst of all economic systems, except for all other economic systems. So like we need a political system based on democracy, but with checks and balances. We need capitalism with checks and balances. And so the totally unrestrained market was discredited in classical economics for about a half century until the late 1970s. And as Reagan came in, some of these people started coming up with these fanciful things about what caused the Depression that didn't really cause it. Like the Smoot-Hawley tariff was a terrible thing, made things worse, but it could hardly cause something that happened more than a year before. So, and some of these people, Amity Schleus in her book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, I wrote a very long and scathing review of that because she's trying to say, if they had just let the free market work, it would have all turned out. And she says such things as, government usurps the function of the market, for instance, in having the Food and Drug Administration. Well, you think about what that means. Well, the market will take care of that. If people die from drugs that will kill them or from bad food, well, then people will stop buying it. So, but that way of thinking started coming back in the 1980s, and over the last 40 years or so, more and more the idea of trickle-down economics has come back. But for a half century, Hoover's failures and ultimately Roosevelt's successes. I mean, he kind of, for many years, was not curing the Depression, but he was making it easier to live with it. And then ultimately the spending in World War II that showed that indeed spending does work. So,
well, the last question I got for you, what lesson in leadership can we learn from Hoover's experience during this time?
Well, again, the same sort of thing. Let me bring up another big event in Hoover's administration, which was the bonus army that had been created. Congress had, had passed a bonus act in the mid-20s, promising veterans of World War I a bonus that wasn't supposed to be paid until 1945. Great sort of thing. You get the votes of veterans and not going to cost anything until sometime down the line. Well, once so many veterans became unemployed, they said, we need the money now, and they wanted it paid, and so many unemployed, they started coming, riding the rails, or however they could get to Washington, and camping out to lobby with their feet Congress to pass the bonus. And Hoover was concerned about these people being there, but he didn't want to use violence against them. He finally decided many of them stayed around after Congress had ended its session. They had no place to go. They were in like a shanty town, a Hooverville in Washington. And Hoover had the military move them out, but he told them not to do this with violence. However, the man who was in charge he was telling not to do it with violence was Douglas MacArthur, and he went in with fixed bayonets and burning the buildings and everything. And so this created these images, photographs on the front page of papers of burning buildings with the Capitol dome in the background.
Yeah.
I mean, Hoover would have lost anyway, but he...
Yeah, that was it.
Yes, because he felt he had to take responsibility for it, even though his orders had been disobeyed, because that would mean, I'm not really in control and in charge. And so he took the blame for it. And so... I think the lessons are: be sure if you're going to be a leader to pick the right time, because you have and of course, as it's usually attributed to Yogi Berra, that predictions are difficult to make, especially about the future. But actually, it was the physicist Niels Bohr who had first said it. But anyway, the future is difficult to predict. But I mean, again, I think Hoover probably would have gone down as maybe not a great president, but a good president had he had been nominated and won in 1920. But his experience was just totally wrong for the time when he was president.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Bob and want to hear more, please visit robertmcelvaine.com and check out any of his numerous books on the Great Depression, such as The Great Depression, America 1929 to 1941, Down and Out in the Great Depression, Letters from the Forgotten Man, or check out his latest book, The Times They Were a-Changin', 1964, the year the 60s arrived and the battle lines of today were drawn. Thank you so much for your time, Bob. This was great.
Thank you, Kenny. Good to be with you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, harass them about listening until they are excited to pass an hour discussing the four-way presidential race and corrupt bargain of 1824, and then write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also follow the show on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, it's time to really crash into modern U.S. history with the man who ended the Great Depression, saved American democracy, and led us through World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I will somehow fit his life and administration into an hour. It's gonna be fun. Next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.